this is a really significant day for me. I began my investigation into my experiences in Project Pegasus around the year 2000, and I was focusing primarily on my childhood experiences in DARPA's Project Pegasus, which was the U.S. time-space program at the time of its emergence in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I was one of the children on the project, and we were involved in different probes to past and future events using different time travel technologies that had already emerged secretly in the U.S. defense technical community. And as I began to lecture about my experiences in 2004, many people said, you know, there's things you're going to be remembering that you don't remember from childhood and even later. And I said, no, I've spent years on this. I've got everything mapped. I've spent thousands of hours, I've traveled thousands of miles, spent thousands of dollars in search of what happened, and I've proved to a factual certainty that the project existed, that it involved time travel technologies, and that I was part of it. I not only spoke to different scholars in the intelligence community, I sought out and had conversations with a number of the project principals who acknowledged to me that the project existed and that I shouldn't be investigating it, talking about it, or writing about it. But I was blocked regarding everything that happened 10 years later in the early 1980s when I was in my late teens and early 20s that utilized one of the time travel technologies that emerged during the early 1970s in Project Pegasus to probe what we were told, or what we thought, that is, what we were taught was the planet Mars. There's now a dispute among some of the project participants whether the jump room program of the early 1980s was accessing Mars or not, whether it was accessing another domain in the time-space continuum. And because I was completely blocked about my Mars experiences, because basically the brainwashing of the early 1980s was so much more effective than the brainwashing of the early 1970s that I defeated and never forgot. I mean, I had spoken about my childhood experiences in Pegasus in junior high, in high school, in college. I even had a couple discussions with my law school classmates up here in the Northwest about Project Pegasus, but I was completely blocked about Mars. So much, in fact, that when I wrote my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, and published it in December of 2008, which was the first paper, essentially the first written work to prove to a scientific and historical certainty that Mars is an inhabited planet, I was still not looking backward and remembering the extremely pressing activities of the early 1980s. I mean, I was striving to complete my undergraduate course of studies at UCLA, studying history, getting my BA in history during the day division, and at night they were tracking me in this, I was auditing this, basically this naval intelligence degree program that the Naval Postgraduate School has dropped civilians into since World War II. So my college years were very, very pressured. I was writing for the Daily Bruin. But what remained blocked is the fact that I was periodically going over to 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo, California, and taking the jump room to another domain in time space. So as I began to speak publicly in 2004 about my time travel experiences, everything to do with Mars was blocked. And it was not in my contemplation that after I went public with my time travel experiences, at least first in the mainstream, on November 11th of 2009, when I first appeared on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie, that members of the general public would begin approaching me, not to discuss being one of the children in the time travel program with me in the early 70s, but a set of activities that we're going to take a look at today, which were the jump room experiences of the early 1980s. The first individual to approach me in about February, March of 2010, a couple months after I was on Coast, was William Brett Stillings of Temecula, California, who I see some of the people in the audience here today had the pleasure of meeting via Skype during my appearance here on November 12th of last year. Brett came forward and reminded me about how we had been trained together, about meeting our mutual fathers, and so forth. And over the next year or so, we began comparing notes about our jump room experiences. And then after I was on Coast to Coast AM on November 10th of 2011 with Brett, and also with Laura Eisenhower, the great-granddaughter of President Dwight David Eisenhower and Mamie Eisenhower, who described how in 2006 and 2007 she was recruited to join the secret U.S. colony on Mars, I was approached by today's special guest, who we're referring to at his request just by his first name, Bernard. Bernard is a distinguished career professional of the U.S. intelligence community, not specifically the CIA. He had actually a more specific ambit than that. And so Bernard called me after the broadcast in November of last year because he remembered me and some of the other project participants that I was discussing on Coast with Brett and Laura appearing as special guests. But he had an entirely different theory of the case, a different theory of what we were actually doing. Because as we'll find out today, Bernie was essentially the investigator, the principal investigator, that the U.S. intelligence community dropped into the jump room program to try to answer a specific set of questions about what was going on. So he's really he's the most informed person who could have stepped forward. And so today, as I mark my 4th appearance here at the Awakening Center, we're really celebrating somewhat of a high watermark in my 10 going on 12-year involvement with my experiences in time travel and basically in the Secret Service of the United States government. We literally have the person who investigated the jump room program appearing with us today because, like Brett Stillings, Bernard had the integrity and the courage and the desire to step forward publicly and reveal what we did and what he was part of, and to corroborate the involvement of some very prominent Americans in the jump room program. So just to contextualize what Bernie's going to be discussing with me, I'm going to interview Bernie after lunch. And we're going to talk I'm going to talk with him for about 90 minutes, 2 hours. But just to contextualize the jump room program, I want to cover basically 2 major areas. One is to do a quick overview again of what Project Pegasus was doing. And you'll get sort of a snapshot or summary or encapsulation of where the U.S. government was in time travel 10 years before the events that we're going to talk about today occurred. Then I'm going to describe my entry and Brett Stillings' entry into the jump room program 10 years later. The jump room program was not part of Project Pegasus per se. It was actually the divergence of the time-space program literally into a secret space program. And so Bernie's going to help us clarify some of those major points. So Bernie, if you could come out at this time, I'd like to introduce you to our audience. This is Bernard. He's a resident of New York City, and he's worked with a number of U.S. presidents, been a confidant of Howard Hughes and other prominent Americans. I'd like to thank you for stepping forward and affirming that the jump room program existed, and
Yes.
and you're going to be able to give us a lot of information today about what we did in that program. So Ken, if you could take a picture.
Yeah, photo op.
I'm calling Bernie the 3rd whistleblower, in addition to Brett, but of course there are other individuals who have also stepped forward. We've got Michael Relf and Arthur Neumann, among others. So actually, we're now talking about 5 individuals who have stepped forward to affirm that the jump room program existed. But Bernie is a special whistleblower in the sense that he's essentially an expert on what happened. He's the person who knows the most because he investigated it for the U.S. government and has a different theory of the case. So Bernie, thanks for coming, and we'll look forward to that interview after lunch. We can go into great detail about what the jump room program accomplished. So thank you for being here.